All right, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you in this lovely, lovely day. Yes, it's beautiful, and we have at least one of our guests today is from Portland, so that was quite a shock. I had to give him gloves, and yes, so welcome everyone. It's tough time in the semester, last day of classes, finals are upon us. Thank you so much for gathering here for this important conversation. My name is Atalia Omer, and I'm a professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies here, and also co-director of Containing Modernities, which is one of the co-sponsoring units of this event, together with the Kroc Institute. We are really fortunate to be able to create those spaces for those kind of conversations here at the University of Notre Dame, and in a time when it's very hard to have those kind of conversations. So I wanted to name this. So we are here today to talk about with the authors, it's great honor of this book, Safety Through Solidarity, a radical guide to fighting anti-Semitism. And yeah, it really is amazing always to have a conversation with the authors. So the co-authors of this book, Ben Lorber, sitting right next to me, works at the moment as a senior research analyst PRA, which is Political Research Associates. And in this position, this capacity, as a senior research analyst, Ben researches and tracks white nationalism and anti-Semitism. He has worked as a journalist, organizer, and movement builder for a long time. And in fact, the first time that I came across his work was when I researched for my book on American Jewish Palestinian solidarity activists. And during that time, he worked as an organizer on campuses with Jewish Voice for Peace. One of the things that we did at the time, not all, the only things. Ben has published widely on right-wing social movements, Palestine, Israel, Jewish culture, and other topics in key really placements. He's a public intellectual, and as is Shane Burley, who is a writer, a filmmaker, as I mentioned already, based in Portland, Oregon. And among many of his writings, he's the author of a book called Fascism Today, what it is and how to end it. So I hope I hope someone will ask that question so that we'll have the answer for this. So really, it's a great honor to have you here, and the way the format will unfold is that I will pose a few questions that also will help to for those of you who didn't have the chance to read the book, to get a sense of what the book is about, where the authors are coming from in terms of wrestling with the question of anti-Semitism from the left, and questions of solidarity. So through my questions, I hope that you get a sense of what the book is about, but also that the questions will generate further questions for you that perhaps go even beyond the book. And so I will start with the first question, which is anti-Semitism the longest hatred? Why? Why not?
Wow.
Yes.
Start with an easy one.
Yes.
Go ahead. Okay, well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having us here. Really an honor. Natalia, thanks for bringing us, and everyone at Notre Dame, the Institute. Thank you for having us. I mean, I think we take a pretty firm stand that framings like the longest hatred often aren't very helpful in understanding anti-Semitism. I'd say every aspect of that phrase I might take issue with. The word hatred. I often think the hate frame is an unhelpful way to understand, not only anti-Semitism, but most forms of oppression. Obviously, there is something called hatred in the world, and there could be hatred against a group in our hearts. But it's more helpful, I think, to understand anti-Semitism as a system of oppression, as a structure of domination, in our world, as a series of power relations that are irrespective of what, love or hatred one might hold in one's heart. And the longest, I mean, on one level, that's I think patriarchy for one is, probably tens of thousands of years old, and, but often, we hear, phrases like the longest hatred a lot in our Jewish community conversations, and often I don't think it's very helpful. It mystifies anti-Semitism as a kind of larger than life, force, detached from history, detached from politics, detached from the structures of our world. It turns it into kind of a specter, and it turns it into like a monster so overwhelming and overpowering that there can be no way to defeat it. We tend to think that anti-Semitism is a form of oppression that humans have built in our unjust, societies, just like, anti-Black racism, just like xenophobia, and we can work together to fight and to end those structures of oppression. So that's a much more helpful way to think about it, in my opinion.
Yeah. I know I'd say thanks everyone for coming out for this. Big thanks to Atalia for bringing us here. I know we're really excited to be able to join you. I think to pick up on what you're saying is that a lot of times when you frame anti-Semitism as this what we call eternalist narrative, that it's lasted for all time, it implicates it as being something that really can't be solved but only mitigated. You really can't go at the underlying foundations of it. We can't fundamentally change the dynamic. No, instead we just have to find a way to manage it. Maybe by funding police more, or by having a militarized state of Israel, something other kinds of method of just pushing back on the encroaching threat. And it also ends up telling a story about anti-Semitism that's in a lot of ways just fundamentally inaccurate. We talk about anti-Semitism in the book as something that has contours. You can identify it. It's not just, quote unquote, hatred or dislike of Jews. It's actually an ideology. It's a way of telling a story about power and telling a story about the world. And instead, when you frame it as the longest hatred, you end up telling a story that all oppression that Jews have faced as Jews or in Jewish communities likely comes from the same source. So it flattens that history entirely, and you lose the specificity. And when you lose specificity, there's nothing you can do about it. I think it also assumes a uniform Jewish experience. I was on a panel a couple of years ago with a colleague. He said they actually didn't agree with the consensus definition of anti-Semitism because they said we're not in agreement about what Jewish flourishing is. And I think when we flatten things, we talk about anti-Semitism as this eternal or longest hatred, we assume that all Jews agree on what is threatening and what Jewish success looks like. And that's simply not true. Jews are a multitudinous people that don't have those agreements. So instead, when we're thinking about anti-Semitism, we bring in a lot of other ideas, histories of anti-fascism, social movements, things like that, because we want to pin down how does anti-Semitism, and more importantly, how does it work with other forms of oppression? How does it protect the powerful? How does it aid other far-right or threatening movements? And then what can we do to actually unseat that?
Okay, so maybe we can go into kind of the weeds, as they say. Can you help us, as we do in the book, and take us through kind of key tropes and concepts and their relationship to real or weaponized anti-Semitism? So a construct like Judeo-Christian, Judeo-Bolshevism, global, the cabal, good Jew versus bad Jew, socialism of fools, a variety of money tropes around Jews, replacement theory. So how, in your kind of analysis, in your activism, how do you see the history of anti-Semitism, how engaging in kind of historical and contextual study of anti-Semitism, how does it help us understand the role of conspiracy theories in the right and the left, in the political right and political left, and why is anti-Semitism such a phenomenon that depends on kind of conspirational thinking? This is something that you develop in the book, and that is right now operative very strongly in the right in the US, but also transnationally. So just help us kind of like work through those concepts and tropes and tease them out.
Right. Yeah. So we look at anti-Semitism as fundamentally a conspiracy theory about power and a belief in the sort of malevolent, evil nature of a particular other, in this case, Jews, but it can oftentimes be someone that is projected to look like a Jew, but maybe they don't use the term Jew. And this was created specifically in a European Christian context. It comes up, emerged out of very specific versions of Christian theology, changed over time and being radicalized, particularly in the second millennia, and then evolved into what we notice as a secularized version of theology. So ideas about Jews as a sort of malevolent Kabbalistic force that's actually controlling power. And of course, within that system, there are some Jews that were pushed into positions of money lending or acting as intermediaries on tax collecting or in administration of rural kingdoms. And so those ended up being kind of added and built into this conspiracy theory. So when we get into sort of secular modernity, we take out some of those theological predictions, and instead it becomes a sort of political conspiracy theory. So instead, Jews controlled banks. They invented and inculcated us with capitalism. They created finance and all these various things that are kind of understood as political or social abstractions. And so those big changing mores that we have in the 1800s are then projected upon Jews at the same time as they're going through their own kind of emancipation, being able to kind of be a part of civic life and things like that. This has a really profound effect on how people understand sort of political disruption and crisis. And we have this sort of repeating a sense of a populist conspiracy theory, people trying to make sense of inequality, trying to make sense of their own disenfranchisement, and basically going back to kind of older ways of thinking, these traditions that have been passed down as kind of folk explanations. So whether or not it's Jews as bankers that are controlling global politics, or it's particular names that signify Jews, George Soros, the Rothschilds, and focusing on them and that. So we have a number of ways that this plays out, like Atalia mentioned, because the reason is that these theories sort of adapt to whatever the crisis or political kind of moment is. So you mentioned Judeo-Bolshevik, the idea that Jews control the Bolshevik movement, that Jews control the left in general, and that the left is generally a Jewish construct. This is one that's been used by the far right for over 100 years at this point, and continues to be as we talk about other versions of the left that sort of Judaized in the right-wing imagination. So the way that George Soros is alleged to have funded Antifa or Black Lives Matter. This is kind of a modern version of it. And I think one of the key ones that you mentioned, and I'll pass off to Ben to kind of get some other ones, is what we call the Great Replacement Theory. And this is really important for particularly American white nationalism, but this also plays out in Europe too. The idea that Jews are sort of controlling non-white social movements as an attack on non-Jewish white people. So the Great Replacement Theory is the idea that Jews or people coded as Jews, maybe they'll call them globalists or bankers, depends on who's doing it, are bringing in non-white immigrants to replace like the quote unquote native born white population. That's sort of like an attack. And this is something that's really held together the white nationalist movement since the Nazis, and particularly in the 50s and 60s as the American white nationalists developed. It really told a story about basically the social advance of the civil rights movement and other social movements was the cause of Jews, that Jews were actually pulling the strings, and they're doing this as an attack on non-Jewish white people to gain their own power. And so you see these conspiracy theories sort of model themselves to the basically political moment that they're in, usually far-right movements, but not exclusively, and how they adapt those social stories there.
So would you say that anti-Black racism in the context of the United States deploys anti-Semitic tropes?
Yeah, it's really foundational to it. We talk about a friend of ours, an activist, Eric Ward, who wrote a really influential article about this, basically arguing that anti-Semitism is a really essential motivator for anti-Black racism. The reason being is that, white nationalists tell a story about Black folks that they're, unable to engage in social uplift, that they're not intelligent enough, they're not capable enough. Well, then how would those social advancement movements work? How would they have been successful? Well, the Jews, of course, right? The Jews are actually controlling that. They control the NAACP, they control Black Lives Matter, they control all these social movements, and they're doing it specifically to attack Gentile whites as part of their sort of like global plot. And so that has been really essential for holding together a lot of this, like this sort of organized movement of anti-Blackness, both in the explicit white nationalist world and actually in the more institutional world, these narratives continue as well. So I think that's been a really important part of holding together racist movements that sometimes don't even focus on Jews as their primary enemy.
Yeah, I think you summed it up really well. I think it's really important for us sitting here at, a Catholic university to really locate the origins of the anti-Semitism rising in our day and age in the Christian world. I
That was my
mean,
next question, but go ahead.
we can look at something like QAnon for an example to kind of trace what Shane was talking about, right? So, early Christianity, right, emerged out of Judaism, and very early on, it had to answer the question of, if Jesus is the Messiah, prophesied in Jewish scripture, why are there still Jews around who don't believe in Jesus, right? And over the centuries, very quickly, there was a theology called replacement theology that was developed that basically said that, Judaism is the old truth, but Judaism has been superseded by the new truth of Christianity. And so Judaism became associated with sin, with everything that was retrograde or archaic. Jews were a testimony of a people who, in the eyes of dominant European Christianity, were blind, to the truth in their own scriptures. And these tropes have material, impact on Jewish communities over centuries, right? I think most Jewish communities today, or many, I wouldn't say all, because Jews also flourished for centuries in Muslim majority countries. But I think for European Jews, especially Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews, we bear the scars and the traumas of centuries of these Christian anti-Jewish, tropes. Jews became associated with the devil, demonizing means, literally turning into a demon. Jews were associated with evil, with sin, with, usury, and all these fantastical tropes evolved out of the imagination of the European Middle Ages of Jews as feasting on the blood of Christian children, for example. That's where the blood libel comes from, and these tropes fueled massacres, expulsions, ghettoization, second-class status. These anti-Jewish tropes also help to fuel anti-Blackness, as Shane was talking about. If you look back into the 19th century, modern European racism and modern European anti-Semitism evolved out of the same imaginary stew of demonizing an other, of developing all of these tropes that imparted upon an other inferior status and supernatural powers. And so you fast forward to 2018, and you have the QAnon conspiracy theory.
Just tell me what QAnon is.
Yeah, so it's a conspiracy theory developed by the MAGA movement during the first Trump presidency that says that a secretive cabal of blood drinking elites is feasting on children, and this cabal is focused in the government, in the media, among Democrats and liberal elites. And this conspiracy theory helped mobilize folks to storm the Capitol on January 6th. It serves as a connective, glue, a narrative kind of glue of the MAGA movement, and it has all the hallmarks of modern anti-Semitism, right? Like Shane was saying, a conspiracy theory that a demonic, literally a satanic, cabal of elites who are clustered at the heights of society. The reality is that for the last 200 years, right-wing nationalist and fascist movements have used these tropes to mobilize millions. And we see it today, like you were saying, with great replacement theory. A cabal of liberal elites is bringing in immigrants, or with the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory is another one that you'll hear on the right. A cabal of intellectuals is changing our kids' gender, right? Basically, this image of the cabal is used again and again to demonize a group and to say, here's why society is wrong, and here's who we have to attack to fix it.
Yeah, thank you. I want to make sure that what was kind of mentioned parenthetically is also brought into the center of the conversation. Ben, you specifically said the story that is being told here is a European story about Europe, and including the experience of Jews. At certain moments, it's not because we disrupted kind of like a historical abstract understanding of the longest hatred. But you mentioned Jews in Arab and Muslim contexts that had radically different experiences. And so I wanted to zoom in on one of the construct of the Christian. That somehow that also denotes or signals to a certain degree how Jews became white. Of course, some Jews became white or incorporated into kind of this narrative of Europe, imperialism, colonialism. So if you want to unpack that.
Yeah.
And make the differentiation between under Islamic and Arab
Yeah.
context and in Europe, Christian Europe.
Yeah, of course. So, so this idea of, a Judeo-Christian civilization really emerged after World War II, right? When European Christianity and Europe as a whole, what we might call the West, but we could, of course, also problematize that construct.
Take my class.
Yes, take your Thomas class for that. Yeah, it really had to reckon with the, or tried not to reckon essentially with the atrocities of the Holocaust, committed in the heart of quote unquote civilized Europe. And so this idea of Judeo-Christian civilization came to signify that there was this unbroken lineage of unity or conviviality or affinity, right, between Judaism and Christianity. And that was essentially saying, here we are the European West over and against the communist East, right? It was a Cold War, construct that was used, to signify we are the white, liberal, capitalist Western order, over and against, barbaric communism. Pretty early on, certainly by the late '60s, Israel was incorporated into this idea of the Judeo-Christian West. And fast forward, to the end of the 20th century and the war on terror. Now, Judeo-Christian civilization is poised over and against, radical Islam, right? And so this leads to the so-called clash of civilizations, right? It leads, to the war on terror, U.S. imperial expansion all over the globe. And it essentially, as you said, it papers over the fact that Christianity was for centuries the source of anti-Jewish persecution in Europe, and it's certainly in other parts of the world, especially in Muslim majority countries, until at least the mid 20th century. There was often a lot more coexistence. We shouldn't paper over. There was real second class status that Jews and other non-Muslims experience in Muslim majority countries. I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture, but there was not a systemic anti-Semitism. There was not this kind of conspiratorial demonization of Jews until later, when that was imported through colonialist Europe, by and large. So in looking at histories of Jewish Muslim cooperation and Jews, Arab Jews, flourishing in Arab lands, we can see alternative histories. We can tell different stories of Jewish thriving throughout the ages that can really disrupt our normative understandings of Israel Palestine as well.
Yeah, I think this gets actually to what we're talking about when we talk about defining anti-Semitism in terms that are narrow enough to actually be able to figure out what we're talking about with some specificity. Because if we're talking about some of the ideas that emerged about Jews in Muslim majority countries, they're very, very different than what you find in Christian Europe. Today, you hear a lot of talk about quote unquote Muslim anti-Semitism, and there's a number of scholars that try and trace it back hundreds of years and says that it has its own tradition and things like that. But when you actually look at like anti-Semitic depictions in Muslim majority countries in Egypt or in Yemen, they actually look like Christian anti-Semitism, because in a lot of ways, when the West exported its colonialism, it exported its ideas too. And so again, just as it happened in Christian Europe, those ideas adapt to a new kind of crisis, a new kind of political context. And like Bennett talked about, there was a long history of coexistence. Don't want to paper over, like he said, the actual real contest there. But as like one Jewish study scholar we interviewed said, it didn't have the pathological level that you found in Europe. And it didn't evolve to have these specific ideas that we have today. And so I think by defining it in that way, we actually walk away, from one of the kind of persistent racist tropes about Muslims and Arab folks in the United States that are inherently anti-Semitic. And this is a big part of anti-immigrant movements, particularly in Europe, is the claim that they're threatening to Jews. But it also helps us like take a real hard look at what anti-Semitism is, so we can put it back into the Christian, European, and colonial context in which it actually emerges.
Yeah, excellent. So, so I think that we can even dig deeper and invite you to reflect on the with kind of the big question, the big and oversimplistic question, and I want you to tease it out, is anti-Semitism, what's the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Are they the same? Why not? Et cetera, et cetera. And, but I want you to get into this, I want to invite you to get into this through reflecting on the title of your book, which is Safety Through Solidarity, which of course disrupt an understanding that somehow Jewish safety, it depends on what the ICJ, the International International Court of Justice, has termed plausible genocide in the current moment, Amnesty International called genocide, and a variety of other sources, including consensus among genocide studies scholars that what Israel but the argument is that it's about safety, about somehow securing Jews, the utter kind of disposability of the whole community of the Palestinians, of Gaza at the very least. So is anti-Semitism the same as anti-Zionism? Yes, no, why? And why did you choose Safety Through Solidarity as the title of your book?
Right, yeah. So I won't make you wait. No, anti-Semitism is not the same as anti-Zionism. I think it's important to think about Zionism, and particularly the mass adoption of Zionism in the United States, and particularly later in the second half of the 20th century, the sort of normalization of it, as part of a Jewish process of sort of adapting to an American model of safety, which is inclusion and whiteness, which is sort of the acceptance of the colonial state model. Police is the fulcrum point of safety. And then, of course, like this creation of an ethno state as the center of Jewish safety. And it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. The idea that anti-Semitism is perennial, it's built into Gentile society, and you will never be rid of it. Therefore, you can only mitigate it. And if we see how severe it can become with the Holocaust, we need something equally severe to sort of protect folks from it. And so this ends up being a lot of the ways that we talk about Jewish safety now, something to be managed, something that we need to protect. Maybe we need to limit speech in some cases. Maybe we need to have sentence additions. Maybe we need to empower the IDF and give state support, things like that. I think we come in from a different model, and we use a phrase, and I think it's important to note this phrase comes from the Jewish left. This is used a lot. We didn't invent it. It's actually very common. And the idea is, instead of having that sense of safety through apartness, we have safety through a community building, basically building lines of solidarity across difference. So we see anti-Semitism not as completely separate from other institutions of oppression. We say it as interlaced, right? It's built right into white supremacy. It's built into the straight state structures and capitalism. So if other communities are targeted by those institutions, then we are as well. And that puts us into alignment immediately. So we acknowledge that. And we talk about, particularly in the second half of the book, we talk about examples of where this overlaps very, very clearly. So like as Ben mentioned, right now there's like an all-out assault on trans healthcare. But when you look and listen to how those attacks are being done, what are people putting in their testimonies at state houses? What are the articles they're writing about it? They have a pretty clear idea of who's responsible for this trans healthcare, right? It's George Soros, it's the Rothschilds, it's globalists, right? There's actually an alignment in their mind of how this works. And so we should have an alignment on how we respond. We connect with communities that have like threats, right? And build that alliance. So when it gets back to the question of anti-Zionism, I think the question that people should ask about this is, where is the anti-Semitism, the alleged anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? There's a long tradition of Jewish anti-Zionism, and the only way to sort of assume that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic is to assume that it's inherently threatening the Jewish people, or that it undermines some kind of natural Jewish claim. And I think instead, we actually look at the reality of Jewish experience. I look at Israel right now, and I don't think to myself, what a tremendous bunch of safe Jews, right? It's actually quite dangerous. It's the most dangerous place to be a Jewish person. And instead, we're saying, what if we had different solutions to that? What if we didn't want to perpetuate the same state systems and systems of inequality that subsequently developed anti-Semitism, right? And so I think we're coming from it from a whole kind of different perspective of how do you build a system of safety that runs and challenges power, and that's actually its foundation.
Yeah, I just want to ground us in the stakes of this conversation right now. More than a year since the beginning of Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, we're seeing a determined and coordinated effort to equate the movement to end that that genocide, the movement for the ceasefire and the arms embargo that we desperately need. We're seeing a concerted, effort by defenders of Israel's, actions, to cynically accuse movements and advocates and professors and students of anti-Semitism, right? We're seeing it developed by the Israeli government and by the US government, a bipartisan effort with Democrats and Republicans, groups like the Anti-Defamation League, as well as Christian Zionists are at the forefront of this. The largest Christian Zionist organization in this country, Christians United for Israel, boasts 11 million members. That's more than the entire American Jewish population, right? And these are folks who are going to state houses across the country, including here in Indiana, and saying, you need to pass a bill that equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And their goal there is to attack democracy, is to suppress freedom of speech. And with the incoming administration, these efforts are going to be supercharged. We are seeing groups like the Heritage Foundation, who are publishing, plans. They have a plan called Project Esther that threatens to take this to the next level.
Explain the
Right.
meaning of, even naming it Project Esther.
Yeah, Project Esther, it's a Christian nationalist motif. They're taking, a passage from the Hebrew book of, Esther that is, the foundation of our Purim story, and they're using it, in a Christian nationalist way to say that it's their time to save the and they're, even though this effort's entirely, literally led by Christian nationalists, they could barely find any Jewish groups to endorse it, right? But they're trying to equate criticism of Israel and Zionism with anti-Semitism, and they're making the cynical appeals to Jewish safety in order to block the solidarity with Palestinians that we desperately need. So I think it's very important to say, you can criticize the policies of the Israeli government just like you would any other nation state. You can criticize the ideology of Zionism, which promotes systems and structures of supremacy in Israel-Palestine. That's not inherently anti-Semitic. That is criticism of a political ideology, not not demonization of Jews, right? So it's very important to make these distinctions, and to say that we, as Shane said, like, we build safety for Jews through solidarity. In this case, with Palestinians, there's no contradiction between building a world that's flourishing and safe for Jewish people and building a free and liberated Palestine. And it's very important to underline that.
Yeah, and that in the spaces of Palestine solidarity, there are many Jews who are in those spaces, in the student encampments. There were many Jewish students who felt they were not there despite being Jewish. They were there because they are Jewish. And this is very important, something that also connects to your previous work. So I want now to invite people to raise questions. Please, a question that is succinct. And yeah, I want to make sure that we get as many voices on the table. Yes, go ahead. A question with a question mark.
The irony of Project Esther, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is that Esther is actually Queen Esther, is buried in Iran, my country, if I'm not mistaken. And now with the Christian Zionist trend going on, the new Trump administration and talks about attacking Iran, it's ironical that Esther was buried in Iran.
Yeah. So we mentioned, yeah. So the question.
So now, yes, I will.
Yeah.
So it is related to the question. And so, when we talk about attacking Iran or not attacking Iran, what comes to my mind is the fluid identities of Iranian Jews. And I want to know if you have any studies done that look at how the Jewish communities that don't live in Israel, in other places.
How
Jewish communities who don't live in Israel, but across the Middle East, balance the inequality of race in their home states, like Iran, versus migrating to Israel and still facing inequality. Does that make sense? How do they perceive anti-Semitism in these two contexts? And what makes them decide to remain in one state and not go to Israel or migrate to Israel?
Okay, let's take another question.
So as you pointed out, we are at a Catholic institution, and one challenge that has been faced here in this campus is, using the Catholic institution's history of anti-Semitism to silence pro-Palestine students on this campus. So I guess I'm wondering what advice or words of wisdom would you give to Catholic institutions to reconcile, their history of anti-Semitism and ensuring the safety of Jewish people, but also uplifting for Palestine students?
Great question.
Good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think there's no contradiction. I think it's absolutely essential for Catholic institutions and all Christian institutions to interrogate the histories of anti-Semitism that are embedded in Christian, Christian theology and iconography and histories, and continuing into the present day. It's important for all of us who were raised in, in the societies that we live in, a society like the US that is shaped and molded by dominant Christianity. It's important for all of us to, to learn about the tropes and the ideas that we can inherit without even, intending to, just as we could reproduce, anti-Blackness, or misogynistic ideas, racist ideas, simply by living in societies that have these forms of oppression. It's important for all of us to interrogate that. So it's really important for Catholic institutions to interrogate that, and also to remain clear that there's no contradiction between interrogating that and supporting freedom and justice for Palestinians. I think these it's ongoing political education can occur on both tracks, parallel and intersecting, right? Study the Holocaust and the Nakba, learn about anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Semitism. Neither has to crowd out the other, and we absolutely can't let accusations of anti-Semitism be used to stifle legitimate criticism.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see us destabilize the notion that support for Israel is a form of paying penance for past mistakes. And I think that this actually is an institutional way that plays out over and over again. So I think actually looking at church history, whether it's from church officials or from rank and file, and making action on that. And that actually has happened to a degree in larger church institutions, more so than some Protestant institutions, particularly in terms of theology. And there's some interesting writing that actually looks at the attempt to actually reckon with that. I think it's also worthwhile to not. I mean, obviously, we talk a lot about not talking about Jews as a monolith. The Catholic Church is a monolith too, right? We have a lot of where I live very near a Pope Pius X church, basically like a Latin liturgy church that doesn't recognize any of the other Catholic. Are they the Catholic Church? I think there's actually a lot of differences in how that happens. So I think acknowledging that differences, that there's different forces and different communities that play it out, and not allowing there to be this one singular narrative. And I think also when you're talking about Palestine solidarity organizing, I think it's worthwhile to talk about the tradition you're coming from a international solidarity tradition, to tradition that's there for equality for all people, and making sure that people understand those foundations, right? I'm not criticizing Israel as some particularly special separate thing, right? It's part of a larger criticism. We're talking about militarism, we're talking about imperialism and colonialism, right? We're not just talking about Israel. So put that back in the context, because I think what people do is they make, in a lot of ways, it's a disingenuous assumption, oh, it's a Catholic institution, and look, they're supporting Palestine. One, Catholic anti-Semitism must have somehow run from one to the other, and that's just not how social movements work. And so I think making that visible to people, I think is important. I think to your question, I think that's a really tough question to answer. I was with I had Shabbos with a Iranian Jewish couple a few weeks back, and you know, the way their parents were from Iran and then when you moved to Israel. And there's not a lot of solidarity with Iran and from those folks, right? There's like the narratives that they have about this is that it was institutional anti-Semitism and that they had to escape and their families were rescued by Israel. You know,
But this is very much a Zionist narrative.
it's a very much a Zionist narrative, and like I don't want to, you know, like from the outside sort of critique Mizrahi narratives about like how they do that, but these become the foundational narratives that sort of maintain a certain, not just a Zionist consensus, but like a very right wing kind of Zionist consensus. And so I think it's hard. I think it's hard for I think that has been allowed to maintain this idea of Israel as a safe haven, but not just Israel as a safe haven, but a militarized Israel that like specifically at war with Muslim neighbors, as they frame it. That is what's necessary. So I think we need to destabilize that narrative a bit.
And because what it really operates against kind of the thesis that that tells us that if you want to fight anti-Semitism, you also have to fight anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Arab racism, because part of what the discursive frame has done is to bifurcate Arabs and Jews, or in the case of, you know, and Iranians are not Arabs, but people, Jews of the region, who were a part of the region, like a part of the fabric of the region, and all of a sudden became incorporated into this, you know, settler colonial frame that draws on that narrative of safe haven, the safety in the form of the tank and the bombs and so forth.
And part of this also is that it projects Ashkenazi history and narratives onto other people's experience. And says, okay, you're experiencing this is part of this long history of anti-Semitism when we're actually very different communities with completely different relationships with other people.
Which goes back to kind of the first question about this abstraction, the longest hatred,
Right.
as if it exists outside of historical contextuality. Ben, you want to add to that?
No, I think you all covered it.
All right, so Professor Musa.
Hi, Ibrahim, thank you. Thank you for your intervention. I want to go back a little bit to the United States and how people think about the history of Catholics in this country, especially Irish Catholics. 150 years ago, they were at the bottom of the kind of the subalterns, and how Catholicism has now become a kind of an acceptable face of America. There's always a lot of hesitancy with the Catholic president, and people pray for the betterment of this country, you know, with the Catholics in control. The issue is, do you, and Shane, I think you mentioned it, or you were hinting towards it, do you think there's an emergence of a certain kind of Catholic Zionism? In other words, in which, given the history of the Catholic Church in Europe at particular times and its role in anti-Semitism, and I think you mentioned the term that overcompensation that is happening, could you identify such a thread, or is it just my reading too much of newspapers and stuff that I'm making these things up?
Or maybe before, like, we would talk about the Catholic Zionism, but also maybe contextualize it within a broader framework of Christian Zionism that was mentioned, but perhaps not everyone is familiar with that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would say, Christian Zionism is a word that we typically associate with evangelicals and Protestants, right? It is long history going back to the 16th, 17th centuries in various iterations, emerging in the 20th century. And today, you know, the base of Trumpism, which, you know, is shifting, but, you know, there's a bedrock there of white evangelical Protestants and non-white, you know, evangelicals, is a core of Christian support for Israel. But we've also seen, yes, the rise of Catholic support for Israel in some quarters. I have less expertise on it, but, you know, I'm struck that in the 50s, one of the first, you know, articulations of this new Judeo-Christian consensus was a book called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, right? And it was a way to say, here's America, right? Here is, you know, post-war America.
Right?
You're white Jew, right? Yeah. Protestants, Catholic, here is, you know, religious diversity and tolerance in our new liberal America, right? And of course, you know, there's no, you mentioned of, you know, Islam there, right? But I think there is a sense in which, yeah, the, you know, and with, you know, reconciliation efforts like, you know, Nostra Aetate, I believe it is, that, you know, was the Catholic Church seeking to interrogate its historical, you know, anti-Semitism. There has been a kind of philo-Semitism that has emerged in some parts of Catholicism that is pro-Israel, and it tracks with broader motifs of American exceptionalism, right? There's deep within our country's motifs as we are the shining city on a hill, much like Israel. We conquered this land. We are an elect, kind of chosen people who is divinely ordained to take possession of this land, right? So there's deep motifs of American exceptionalism that that cut across denominational affiliations and lead millions of Christians to have affinities with a certain idea of Israel they've been taught.
I think there's also like a certain affinity with Israel that doesn't just come specifically from a Christian Zionist theology. We have an emerging kind of far right Catholic contingent in the GOP that supports Israel as a foundational piece of U.S. foreign policy, partially as a way of issuing American control into the Middle East, and so there's a certain sort of just politics of it that's existed. And I think also because evangelical Christian Zionists made this such an establishment part of the GOP, they inherit that tradition and sort of Catholicize it, right? Like they add that sort of bent onto it, right? And then you have at the same time relationships with Israeli right-wing figures or European far-right folks who also have a relationship with the Israeli right that are building those connections too. So they have actual relationships with these people. So you see an emerging Catholic right that actually is developed. And once you develop those material relationships, then we're not just talking about ideology, right? We're talking about actual deal making and coordination. Yeah.
Yeah, this is excellent. But perhaps if you can also clarify, is philo-Semitism the love of Jews? Is it the opposite of anti-Semitism? Why not? And also, what are your thoughts on this kind of like discourse that is called anti-Semitism and what political, I mean, we kind of touched on it, but it's also kind of a concept that is heard a lot, is quite ubiquitous, the anti-Semitism. That it has some political function, political, economic, otherwise.
Yeah, I mean the term philo-Semitism, love of Jews. There's a joke that I've heard a number of people make, which is that a philo-Semite is an anti-Semite who likes Jews, because what philo-Semitism does is it tends to use stereotypes about Jews or flatten images of Jews, but then present them in an appealing way. And it reveals a lot of priors. So a lot of what we talk about philo-Semitism in the Christian evangelical world or the Christian Zionist world, the philo-Semitism they're having is often the Israeli Jew, strong, serving in the IDF, morally upright, heterosexual, of a certain appearance, right? Like this is the image of the Jew that they sort of celebrate. And then in a lot of ways sort of misappropriate Jewish history, mistell Jewish history, take Jewish customs and ritual items out of their original context as a part of that celebration. But when you look at Christian Zionist theology, which may have motivated that, there's not a lot of love for Jews, right? Christian Zionists see the establishment of the state of Israel as part of their eschatological vision, right? The end of which Jews either face genocide or compulsive conversion, which is another way of saying they have to stop being Jewish. And so I think the question ends up being like when they celebrate that they have this image of such love for the Jewish people. What is that love about? Is it their utility they find to it? Is it a way for them to project their own self-image or politics? And I think that the question of anti-Semitism, we often use that word for the whole network of these organizations that have a sort of a technocratic solution to the problem of anti-Semitism, the best known being the Anti-Defamation League, right? They are the experts. They know how to handle this. They will consult with the organization and figure out how to connect you with the police or the secure community network or some other kind of like militarized security body. And that's how you fight it. Not, for example, bringing you into alignment with other communities and building cross-community networks and coalitions. That's a whole different way. Instead, they want to separate it as much as possible. So when we say anti-Semitism, we often talk about that particular approach, the approach that takes it away from any of that cross-collaboration.
Yeah, thank you. Olivia, student.
Thank you so much for being here, both of you. This has been super cool. I just wanted to build off of Professor Bruce's question. Recently, the Vatican has unveiled their nativity scene, and the baby Jesus was wrapped in a keffiyeh, which is such, and this is not, it's surprising because the optics are very, very good, and they did a good job with it, but that is great. But there's Vatican though, so, but also like Pope Francis has been very outright calling for a ceasefire in Gaza.
And calling it genocide.
And calling it genocide. And not to say that he's not also anti-Semitic in other ways as well, I'm sure he is, but but it's something that I know that American Catholics like to critique the Pope, especially conservative Catholics like to critique the Pope on practically everything else. So I was wondering if you have seen any of these like Catholic Zionists who are like raging against this, raging against the ceasefire. How do they interact with the structure of the Vatican, especially these more fundamentalist ones who still rely so heavily on the structure and the institution of papacy?
Okay, great. And then we'll take a question from Laurie, Nathan.
Great. Sorry, Adam. Susie, thank you to the authors. Thank you for your work and thank you for your book. The idea of safety through solidarity sounds to me a little like it's motivated by self-interest rather than by commitment to justice. The motivation sounds pragmatic when you spell it out, because anti-Semitism is intertwined, as you argued, with other forms of prejudice. That's quite different from saying we stand in solidarity, all of us, with all people who are oppressed and marginalized and discriminated against, not as a matter of self-interest, but as a matter of righteousness. Question mark.
I mean, yeah, really good provocation. I appreciate it. I mean, for your question, I can't pretend expertise on this. I know that, that in a broad sense, traditionalist Catholics do not love the Pope for being too liberal, but I can't pretend to claim in-depth expertise on it. So, but I was very, very glad even to see the baby in the gift. I thought it was a really like provocative symbol. And yeah, I guess, to your, to your provocation, I would say that, I remember a friend of mine worked in he works in the immigrant justice movement, and he said to me recently, Ben, I fight anti-Semitism because I want to stand. He's not Jewish. He said, I want to stand with Jews. I want to be allies to Jews. I care about Jewish people, and that's why I want to fight anti-Semitism. And I also really recognize it's for my own liberation too. It's crucial to the success of winning migrant justice, winning freedom for my communities. I know that unless we undo this architecture of the right saying George Soros is behind immigration all the time, we are, the right is using that to mobilize millions to demonize, immigrants. So we aren't going to win until we end anti-Semitism. I really appreciated that, because I do actually think there is a role for self-interest in politics. I don't think it's realistic to imagine that the ideal subject of a liberation movement is only committed to ideals of righteousness that are totally selfless. I think most human beings join a social justice movement, say because they want higher wages, to feed their families, or they want to get cops off their street. They don't want to be thrown in jail, or they're undocumented. They don't want ICE to drag them out of their homes and deport them. People act from self-interest. I think the trick isn't finding a way to divest ourselves completely of self-interest. It's in finding a synthesis between the particular and the universal, if you will. Between finding like a starting point of self-interest and being grounded in your own stake, your own investment in liberation, your own I fight for women's rights because I recognize that the patriarchy hurts me too, as a man. I fight, racism because, among other reasons, in some sense, a white supremacy harms us all, including white folks. And I think, finding that self-interest is actually really important. So yeah, that's kind of the, I'd say, yeah.
Yeah, I will second that. Yeah, you're 100% right. It is a position of like locating yourself in the struggle, not just out of righteousness. Not that like acting out of righteousness is a bad thing. I think like honestly, like we have like rich moral lives, and like I think that motivates a lot of people. I don't think it motivates the level of action we're calling for. I think people have to see themselves in it and have deeply invested, because without that, I think self-interest hasn't been sort of transformed into something that can be collectively liberated. And then when self-interest comes into it, and it always will, it ends up being more myopic and separated. So I think like rebuilding that, and this is like, I think the sound foundation of every social movement, you know, like I spent a lot of time in the labor movement. Like when you engage in support workers in organizing, it's nice to help them win nice things that, but that's actually not the reason most people are there. It's because they are empowered by building a working class movement. You know, it's basically the rising tide raises all boats, and we want people to be really deeply invested, because I don't want them to just act out of sort of like moral outrage. I want them to act for the rest of their lives, right? Like I want this to be this sort of like revolutionary project that they invest in. And so I think seeing those connections, I think it really bonds people. I also am not an expert on the Catholic politics, but I will say, like, it does seem increasingly like for the Catholic far right, the Vatican is the object of hate in a way, like increasingly. So I think it's like in a weird, and I think there's a certain element in which like the Catholic hierarchy is now becoming this icon that the Catholic right can kind of focus on as a way of sort of like being iconoclastic and breaking away from. So and what I've seen, which is just very little in response to this, it's been about the same thing.
Yeah, and also, I think to the point about the actual networks that have developed through investment in research centers and so forth, you see circulation of kind of neoconservative discourse, kind of boomeranging with institutions that are based in Israel, but also in the United States, and Jewish and Catholic and other kind of like, so you see convergences of forces that are not rooted in kind of the theological understanding of the kind of the Jews as an instrument of fetish in Christian redemption, but are Zionists nonetheless. I mean, we have someone like Joe Biden claiming over and over again how Zionist it is. And it's rooted in, you know, more kind of liberal form of Catholicism. So this is just to say that Christian Zionism is a much broader phenomena that is baked into the liberal discourse, and also the convergence of what Jewish theologian Mark Ellis calls the ecumenical pact of, you know, we'll get you off the hook of your anti-Semitism, and you'll get us off the hook of the Nakba. Yeah, and that is something that is articulated also by liberal forces, not only radical. Okay, so let's take a couple more questions. Francesca, and then you, and then David.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. As a Jewish person at a Catholic institution, it's just like incredible to be able to have these conversations. Yeah, so I'm Jewish, and I'm also a very active organizer with Palestinian Liberation, 24 investment on campus, which is not political at all. But my question is sort of like zooming into those spaces of like how to deal with actual anti-Semitism in those spaces. And I think if I need like 2 seconds to just like give a little bit of context, like I think sometimes for me personally, like sometimes I feel like I should sort of confront it and call it out, and sometimes I feel like what Jewish people are doing, like in the name of all Jewish people, even if it isn't really, is like so horrific that like maybe we can kind of just let it slide to like focus on the bigger picture of what we're trying to obtain. And so I'm wondering if you can reflect on sort of like what you think about like real anti-Semitism within Palestinian liberation, and also like what the role of Jewish people in navigating that is.
Great, and then I'll take your question.
I want to circle back to this conversation about like moral outrage, righteousness versus self-interest. And before that, thank you so much for coming. This has been great, and I look forward to reading the book. And I was thinking about, as this conversation was happening, when we think about nonviolence and how we assume that it works is by making this like moral appeal, right? Like you're being oppressed, you're the victim, and kind of you rely on that public outrage and moral outrage for the mass mobilization. So I think what you said really struck me in that sense, and I have my own problems about that logic of nonviolence, but really transforming self-interest beyond that myopism
it sounds like it made me new way to think about nonviolence, and I was like really curious about some of the practical things you may have discussed in the book or have thought about and how to achieve solidarity practically on the ground.
Great, and then we'll take, if you
want-
if you are able to
Yeah,
take
those
another,
two.
another question, if you can take three at once,
No.
you think?
We can,
No.
we can
Two.
choose.
No.
So take two.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for you both for these really good questions. I mean, I would say first, on question of anti-Semitism in our movement spaces, it's there, and it's, of course it would be there because there's anti-Blackness in our movement spaces. There's misogyny. There's like I was saying, there's these forms of oppression are baked into our society, and until we do the work of unlearning them, they're going to reappear. They've reappeared. They can come through tropes. Conspiracy theories that quote unquote Zionists are controlling the world, or Zionists are controlling the media. Zionists are controlling the government, and that's why Israel's oppressive, or that's why the U.S. supports Israel. That's a conspiracy theory that gets it backwards. The U.S. supports Israel because it's our naval, it's our naval base in the Middle East. It's our strategic outpost for imperial dominance. And there can be conspiracy theories of Zionist cabals, behind the scenes. There can be, tropes of Christian anti-Judaism that resurface. I've gone to protests and I've seen signs, that most of the signs I see are incredible and inspiring. To be clear, every once in a while over the years, I might see a sign of like a hook-nosed Israeli soldier feasting on the blood of a child or something. And has the IDF killed thousands of children in Gaza since October 7th? Of course. Nonetheless, these images, can draw on Christian anti-Judaism. So it's important to be vigilant. I don't think we should let it slide. I think for every form of oppression, we should be brave and name these things, from a place of solidarity. It doesn't mean calling, if you want to say, calling in versus calling out, I think is often an overused framework, but I think it works, right? I think rather than a kind of having this, retributive or punitive logic of like, calling each other out, I think, the way to address these things, whether it's anti-Semitism or misogyny in our movement spaces or any kind of oppression, is to have strong relationships built on trust, and to talk to each other and to be brave and to lean into discomfort and have hard conversations, based on the relationships we've built from showing up for each other. It's not always, easy, and there's a learning process and it doesn't always go well, but I think it's important to do that.
Yeah, I think, when we're interviewing folks for the book and we ask a lot of folks like personal experiences of anti-Semitism, the majority were from Palestine spaces. It's, self-selecting group, right? We know a lot of people from this group, so it makes sense. But one of the reasons is it just comes up, not because it's unique to that movement, but because we're talking about particular issues where those the problems that come up. Any social movement space, you have bad ideas or bad manifestations. It just happens to look this particular way in this particular one. So I think it's worth doing that in the same way it's worth doing that in any sort of movement space. There's a couple reasons though. Let's get back to the self-interest question, like anti-Semitism is bad strategy. If like your image of fighting for Palestinian liberation involves like a Rothschild cabal, at the center of the UN, you are probably going to lose, right? Like you're not actually going to make those sorts of gains. And when people bring in those ideas, it's really moving away from that collective liberation idea. You're not able to see yourself in it because it's now a threatening space. You're not actually able to understand the problem. There's a lot of problems that I think end up coming in there. And I promise you, if someone says I've done something anti-Semitic in those spaces, something else really bad's about to come next. It will not just stop there. And so I think finding those ways, but the difference I think is that the way that a lot of what we call anti-Semitism groups approach this is to say, okay, you saw this thing happen, let's all back away from it. This thing's a problem, let's quarantine it and get rid of it. And that's not at all, I think, the appropriate thing. I think it's important to put it in its context. And even when an organization doesn't make the action that you want them to, that doesn't necessarily taint the entire movement, right? Like there's still a genocide happening and we still have to organize to stop it, whether or not someone did something wrong. And so I think having that sort of approach is useful. Yeah.
I also want to address your question, your question. We had really, we interviewed a lot of movements in the book who, you know, we heard inspiring stories of, you know, in New York after there were Islamophobic attacks. We had Jewish communities in New York who were showing up, you know, to defend their Muslim, you know, comrades on the streets. And a year later, after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting happened in Pittsburgh, we had, you know, the same Muslim groups were showing up to defend Jewish prayer. And, you know, it was these communities not relying on the cops, not relying on division and fear, but saying, we're going to put this into practice through showing up for each other, right? Or we told the stories of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, when Jewish and Muslim and many other groups all came together, you know, for a shared, you know, project of keeping fascists off our streets. And so in those moments, I think you see what you were describing, the kind of enlightened self-interest, if you would call it, of the groups coming together, you know, starting from a place of self-interest maybe, but not, you know, ending there, and weaving that into a broader story of collective liberation.
I think you're bigger with that some instances it's more obvious, I think, than others. So we have like a section of the book talking about people who organized in Charlottesville against Unite the Right. I actually think the self-interest is pretty obvious, right? Synagogues and anti-fascist groups had a pretty clear self-interest and it wasn't that complicated.
Yeah.
But I think other ones, it does become more complicated, you know, and so I think, like, for example, you know, there was, I think, a lot of organizing I done when I was young, highlighting the fact that a lot of like the policing methods that Israel used basically in the first Intifada then came into attack protest space later on, right? It's very similar to the way that, you know, police in Northern Ireland put down Irish Republican protests right before they used that in the mainland to attack anti-fascist protesters in the 70s, right? They have those connections. So like, if you can find those fulcrum points, that I think is the point at which movements become really effective, is like when they're able to find how those institutions overlap. And it's not always entirely obvious. And I think when it comes to international solidarity, that's actually really complicated. So I think it's again about like having that longer term vision, which is why when you hear an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory come in, it demolishes that ability for that you find that kind of like edge that actually works.
Great, David, go ahead.
This is gonna be a little provocative, but I'm gonna kind of make it less provocative, hopefully clarify. Is Zionism sort of anti-Semitic, or is there similarities between Zionism and anti-Semitism that need to be explored a little?
You're not the first to ask this.
I know. But I'm meaning in this sense in the demographic, great replacement with the classical one, like, so for anti-Semitic, as you were pointing out, even going back to Spain, it was expulsion of Jews, right? It was like, we didn't want them to take over our society, they were becoming demographically a dominant group, and therefore that was this genocide and expulsion or euthanasia or all these other things are the solutions. But Zionism also has this aspect to it, right? That has to preserve the Jewish population demographically, and any threat to that is viewed as, you know, anti-Semitic or, you know, whatever you want to call it. So that's the affinity between them. I don't think, yeah. Is that a question?
Yes, it is a question.
Yeah, I can jump in. I just did a paper on this.
You know a lot more than
I think so. So this is one of the problems of the equation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is one and the same, is that people can be Zionists for fully anti-Semitic reasons, right? So you have a long history of Christian Zionism, Ben talked a lot about. You have certain versions of white nationalism that agree they would like Jews to leave and go somewhere else. They would like them to go to Israel or anywhere else.
Richard Spencer himself.
Right. And there's a lot of like long history of that sort of expulsion. There are some white nationalists that claim that they're in solidarity with Palestine, mainly because they see Israel as a Jewish cabal. But like it's really about their fundamental practicals. If they can see Zionism is removing Jews from white countries, then they may support that. There's also a Jewish tradition that, like, for one, sees the diaspora itself as sort of this weakening effect. And you see a lot of early Zionist writings where they portray particularly European Ashkenazi Jews as these weak, effeminate men. You know, they're letting these things happen to their families. They need to be kind of rebirthed through this as a new Hebrew nation. And it's really, and sometimes when you look at those writings, they're very indistinguishable from European Christian anti-Semitism. Like, it's very, very, very similar. And again, today you have this sort of Zionist political project that's basically coordinating with all these far-right movements across Europe and the United States that have increasingly far-right conspiracy theory-based ideology, yet are supporting Israel. So at the same time as they're sort of like championing the Great Replacement theory and talking about the dangers of these globalist cabals, they're also talking about Israel as the important center for Western power in the Middle East. And so I think there is a strong thread of that. I don't want to always overstate it, because I think that's a particular version of it, but it's one that gets ignored, particularly as we look at like modern American pro-Israel politics as being dominated by the Christian right, who do have a lot of those politics underneath them.
Yeah, well, you said it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Could you guys speak a little bit about anti-Semitism on the left? Are you worried about maybe it being more entrenched there, growing there? And does equating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism make it harder to detect actual anti-Semitism?
And okay, great. And then we'll take a question from Anna.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for this talk. I guess I have also kind of a practical organizing question, like thinking in the context here in Northern Indiana and the election and the changes that are coming, and the examples you've given of like showing up, you know, outside the mosque, outside the synagogue, and that, I mean, I'm thinking at least about how that might be something our community should be ready to do. But, and I'm part of, you know, groups here that are organizing for ceasefire and things like that. And I'm not quite sure how the link then gets made with the sort of establishment Jewish community that might not appreciate that kind of work on Palestine and and critique of Zionism. And like, but that solidarity still seems like we need that tangible, like we need to move on that. And I don't know, I'm just curious what kind of advice you might have.
Yeah. Really good questions. I mean, yeah, I mean, I would say yes and yes to your question. I might say, anti-Semitism, like all other forms of oppression, as we've been saying, you know, can exist and does exist on the left until it's confronted. And it's real, but I think the difference is that the left is a space where these ideologies can be confronted and can be unlearned. And there's often, you know, many folks of goodwill in our movements who want to learn and who want to learn how they can do better. And I also think it's massively overinflated, and it's made very difficult to combat and address by all the weaponization, by all of the discourse in our media, by bipartisan leaders, you know, by some establishment Jewish organizations that says that anti-Semitism's main home is on the left, or anti-Semitism on the left is the greatest threat to Jews, right? Which is not true. I think that, you know, the data shows that overwhelmingly the greatest threat from violent and structural anti-Semitism is found on the right. It's found, bolstered, by the MAGA movement, by current society, and we believe that the Jews' greatest hope for safety comes essentially from movements for social change, right? So yes, anti-Semitism, can exist in our movements. Since October 7th, we have seen, there is some anti-Semitism that we've seen, on Twitter, or in protests. There's a lot of people who are encountering these ideas, for the first time. They don't have a very developed analysis yet. They retweet things that they don't think very hard about, or they haven't done the work of interrogating their biases. And so this stuff is here, but I think there's overwhelmingly a lot of people in our movements who want to learn about it and who have a developed analysis, to detect certain, tropes or discourses and who want to keep doing this learning. So I think that it's important to be real that it does exist, but also to be clear-eyed about where the greatest, threat is. Yeah. Do you have thoughts about that or the second?
Yeah. I mean, I think like you said, like I think the focus on it in disproportionate ways makes it harder. It makes it harder for people to hear it. I think there's a thicker skin about those, and the accusation doesn't have much effect because people are used to deflecting it. And there's not a lot of trust, and it requires a lot of trust if people are going to kind of accept criticism and do something with it. So that I think is something that has to be rebuilt. I think the evidence is really clear that its natural home is on the right. And I think we should like say that and like remind ourselves of that, because I think that gets missed here a lot. There's a long history of anti-Semitism on the left, and it does work a little bit differently. But it also works out in sort of if we are willing to sort of like jump into the political left and hold it to account for its ideas, because those ideas are sort of built into it. If the left is something that's working towards greater equality, confronting oppression, that's actually the ideas it's offering, then we sort of hold that to account. The right doesn't have an interest in that. That is not how it's built. And so there's not really that mechanism of which to sort of address it. So I think like that is why I feel like a lot more faith going into leftist spaces and confronting that. And the right is the people who maintain this. I think to your question, like, I mean, solidarity is a two-way road, and if they're not getting on the road, it's really hard, I think. We've had this conversation, we had a conversation with, was it like a JCOA when I'm there first, we had with a meeting of rabbis, and I asked them like, well, how is your ecumenical work going? And they're like, well, it's been really tough. We just have a relationship with the mosque, but it's not going so well. And I'm like, why isn't it going so well? And they're like, well, they asked us why we wouldn't say genocide, and I'm like, okay, why wouldn't you say genocide? Like I was like you actually have to do, you have to earn this, like you earn these relationships. That being said, I think like making it known that people are available, particularly in supporting people, like for example, supporting them if they're being threatened by anti-Semitism, that doesn't come with a litmus test, right? Like I'll show up at the Orthodox shul, I'm not asking what they think about Israel, right? I'm just like there to support them with that. I think more of that sort of forward-thinking work actually does sort of provoke people to do the same thing. And so that way, all of a sudden, like this question of Israel protest isn't like the operative question in that relationship, and it can be addressed for when there's actual relationships happening. But I think it's really attractive to back away from the conviction so as to build that relationship. I don't think that's good either. You know what I mean? So I think like, you know who you are, you know what you've worked on, and they can know that too, and they can make the choice if they're going to take your kind of open hand on that. I think.
No, yeah.
Great. So final question that I have that clarify, maybe I should have started with this because it takes us back to kind of your positionality and also my positionality and how this whole discourse as a Jewish Israeli scholar, all those in American academy, where so much of the weaponization of anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism mechanisms, technologies, really police the boundaries of what does it mean to be Jewish. And so how do you navigate that? And also how in and of itself it plays into the long history of that bifurcation of good Jew versus bad Jew, which is something that you write about in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really inspiring about our moment over the last year or so is that there's been a growth of new progressive Jewish movements that have taken the streets to demand a ceasefire, that have been part of encampments, right, doing Palestine solidarity,
Saying not in my name.
So yeah, saying not in our name, and also owning our community's complicities. I've also seen really inspiring Christian movements for a ceasefire that have challenged Christian complicity and Christian Zionist complicity in Israel's genocide. I think we need a lot more of that, to be honest, because Christians are demographically a much overwhelming larger group in this country, but But I've been really inspired by the movements that are building, liberated and flourishing Jewish identities and lives and rituals, beyond national. And in many ways, these aren't new movements at all, right? There have been progressive Jewish movements for over a century that have articulated expansive visions of Jewish identity and ritual, grounded in justice, grounded in values of tikkun olam, and changing the world, grounded in relationships, and so I've been really inspired to be part of these movements and these communities that aren't putting nationalism at the center and that are rejecting this.
But on the other hand, I want to push you a little bit more.
Yeah.
Not really you, but it's
Yeah,
for
yeah.
pedagogical reasons.
Yeah.
But I'm reflecting at the scene of the hearing, Elise Stefanik, being the defender of Jews against these professors, academics, presidents of universities, women, and all of a sudden someone who has, explicitly upheld the Great Replacement theory. She is, in that position, policing, what does it mean to be Jewish?
Yeah.
And also there are ramifications of this.
Yeah.
And of course, when the first president resigned, she said one down, more to go. And now it's very clear with the Project Esther and so forth that the academy is, is going to be under further assault.
Yeah.
And how anti-Semitism, the weaponized anti-Semitism, is what is used opportunistically.
Yeah.
And it's not about the Jews.
Yeah, of course.
It's not about the Jews. It's not about Jewish safety. So anyway,
Yeah, of course. No, Jewishness is contested terrain right now, and there's a lot of forces who are trying to define Jews for their own ends, and trying to say that the U.S. is so invested in the Middle East and is so invested in working with the Israeli government to bomb in Gaza because of Jewish safety, or we have the right saying we have to dismantle DEI, in universities to keep Jews safe, right? Or with Project Esther, we have to basically dismantle a range of progressive organizing to keep Jews safe, and none of us none of it keeps Jews safe, and I think that's become very clear in the last month when you have 80% of the American Jewish community who did not vote for Trump and did not vote for this agenda that we're going to carry out in our names. And I think it's incumbent upon us to continue to challenge that. In many ways, it's a continuation of the same old way that I think nationalism has used the figural Jew, has used appeals to Jews, appeals to the Jew of their imagination, to pursue their own ends. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's like a battle for whether or not like the diaspora Jewish world is going to speak for itself, or whether they're going to be, or how they're going to be slotted into larger political battles. I think part of this, self-definition too, is like how people are reimagining Jewishness now in ways that are maybe different than their parents or generations before, because the way that those identities or positionalities have been used to reflect power. Like, for example, like when I engage as a Jew, I engage with Judaism separate, from what I think a lot of people I've kind of like grew up around, where Zionism or affiliation with these big Jewish political institutions was the fulcrum of the Jewish identity. Instead, I turn to ritual and text and tradition and things like that. It's a lot of people in the Jewish left do. And that in a way is a sort of break with the status quo of Jewish identity, and I think there's a lot of people like parsing that out, because I think right now we'll decide what the future of a diasporic Jewish identity actually looks like, and whether or not it's going to engage separate from that, whether it's going to have its own identity, or if it's going to continue to be kind of pulled back into a power play over international politics.
Well, with this, let's thank Ben and Shay.